So welcome to the Hollow Path podcast. And tonight's guest, I am very glad to welcome Darragh Mason, who is not only the host of Spirit Box, which is, from my money, one of the best and most thoughtful podcasts out there on topics of the strange, the spiritual, and the folkloric, but also is a creator, an artist, a photographer, and a writer. And I'm hoping to dig into those different aspects of his activity and how they work together. Darragh, very pleased to have you on this evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Really delighted to be here.
It's one of those things where you know, we have kind of known each other a little bit for the last couple of years, and you invited me onto your podcast, Spirit Box,
right.
about a year and a half ago. And so we're doing one of those you know, return leg things, which is great, you know. But I must say, my experience with you speaking to you on your podcast was really interesting because it was a breakthrough for me.
Right.
Because for a start, your podcast is one that has a big listenership, like it's kind of well respected and well regarded. And also you got me to kind of speak openly about some experiences with the strange and the supernatural and with spirit that I hadn't heretofore said out loud.
Yeah.
Now, that was interesting for me. It was kind of a breakthrough for me. And in some ways, I get the impression that your podcast is like that experience over a very prolonged period of time for you as well. A coming out.
Yeah, yeah, it certainly is. You know, like the podcast has meant that I'm coming up like to 120 episodes now, and it's like that's you know, it's close to like 150 hours of conversations with people like yourself, who've experienced extraordinary things, either by accident but mostly deliberately, you know. Magicians, witches, what have you.
Did you started in 2018? Is that right?
I started doing kind of like lectures and films and stuff on YouTube. I think about like 2016. Okay. I don't know. It was 2017 actually. I'd done some lectures at Treadwell's bookshop on my photographic work with the Djinn and the Agori, and I turned those lectures into YouTube videos, and like it kind of started from there. But it wasn't until like 2019 that I decided to kind of turn it into a podcast. People were saying to me, like, on YouTube, this would be a great podcast. So I started from there, and I think my first 10 episodes were kind of the audio files from those videos.
Good. Very good. Do you think, I mean, this is a slightly parenthetical question, but is there a difference, and what is it, between being a YouTuber, like having a YouTube channel, and having a podcast? Because you say that you were doing YouTube videos on these topics, and people were like, oh, you should do a podcast. What's the difference?
I mean, it's a very good question. I don't really know, to be honest. You know, like, I mean, I personally prefer to listen to podcasts. Probably the two biggest media that I consume would be podcasts and online video. But it would be mostly podcasts. You know, I prefer that type of long form content. YouTube can be difficult to kind of get good long form content on YouTube, like just by the nature of the algorithm. It tends to be kind of quite snappy edits and all that kind of stuff. There's plenty of people doing it and doing it really well, but I think, you know, I think it's relatively easy to do both, you know.
Absolutely. And of course, you know, I upload these episodes to YouTube as well.
Oh, cool.
A lot of people do that. But by the way, you're allowed to veto the visual if you want afterwards, when you see the data yourself. But the thing is, I think that there's a difference in, maybe it's the target audience, but maybe it's also the tone of the medium. Like when you say, you know, I'm a YouTuber,
Hmm.
you expect something that's like a little bit kind of shock jockey, like a little, or like a streamer who does their
Yeah.
playgrounds on video games. But podcast is a bit more chin strokey, you know, it's a bit more kind of like, oh, a
Mm-hmm.
podcast. Gosh, podcast is like radio on the internet. It's like a radio show,
It is essentially, yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And YouTube is a different beast. And then, of
Mm.
course, you know, I mean, TikTok obviously is like the bite-sized version or whatever. But I'm really interested, if you don't mind, and I know that you've probably told the story elsewhere. In fact, just to your podcast, Spirit Box, as I said, is one of my real top favorites for thoughtful, like long discussion on these topics. And the other one that is my other real big favorite is Douglas Batchelor's What Magic
Yeah.
Is This?
Yeah.
And I recommend to anyone listening to you guys, you both appeared on each other's shows.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're just two episodes that are absolutely brilliant, because I think you two have a kind of a thoughtfulness to your approach
Mm-hmm.
that rings very well with each other. But so whereas you may have told the story many times, perhaps you could give us a quick sort of précis of that initiatory experience, your origin story, because you are and were a photographer.
Yeah.
And then you encountered the Djinn, and that seems to be where things began.
Yeah, I think it's where stuff started getting a bit wild. Firstly, it's lovely to be held in the same level of esteem as Douglas. Douglas is absolutely brilliant, and he's a gentleman as well as a scholarly magician. So that's, if you're listening, Doug, hat tip.
Shout out.
But yeah, so in 2016, I went to Delhi to shoot the locations associated with a book by William Dalrymple called City of Jinns. And there was a number of locations in Delhi that he mentioned in the book. So my goal was to kind of go ahead.
I can ask, like, this was in your capacity as a reportage photographer,
Yes.
as a travel photographer, and you would have had your work published in like sort of very glossy upscale magazines and things like that. And this was an assignment, or were you doing it?
Well, a lot of it was pitch work. So right. I'd write a proposal, send it to my agency, and go like, you know, you guys interested in this? If I shoot this, will you promote it? And they'll run it out to their picture editors across their network. So I worked with two agencies, one in it was based in Lebanon, one in Europe, and then one in the States called Redux. So that's who I worked with. And they would either take the whole package as a story, or they would do individual images, that kind of thing. But a lot of the time I'd write the pitch to get people interested, you know, and then go off and shoot. So I knew I was going to go to Delhi. I spent a lot of time in India over the last, I've been there 4 times, and decided to go back and shoot this story about the Djinn. I was working with a young Kashmiri photographer who worked in the Delhi office for the agency that I was working with, and he helped massively. He basically was my fixer. He took me around. He sorted everything out for me. And it's really, really brilliant, and a great photographer in his own right. We went to a number of locations around Delhi. Like fantastic places. There was one place called what's it called? Feroz Shah Kotla, which was part of, Delhi's made up of different cities, and it was part of a city originally called Firozabad. And that was said to be home to 10,000 Djinn. So went there, and I suppose to give you a little bit more context, I was used to India. I've been there a lot. I'd spent 6 months knocking about North India. But on this trip, everything that went wrong could go wrong. So like my camera failed 2 weeks out. from going, and like catastrophically failed, and to the point where like just multiple engineers couldn't fix it. They're like, we don't know what's wrong with this. They just kept getting dirt on the sensor, and they clean it, take a couple of shots, the dirt would be back. Right, so this happened repeatedly to the point where like the camera just got scrapped. Right, so that was weird. Right, managed to source another camera body before I went. Arrived, we changed hotel 3 times in 2 days. It sucked. You know, my dad broke his tooth in Heathrow as we were going, because he came with me. So we had this like just litany of catastrophes. So that it was just bad omen after bad omen. But about around the same time my camera broke, I had a dream about one of the locations. I didn't realize it was one of the locations. I kind of figured it out when I turned up there, right? A place called Nizamuddin Darg, which is a tomb of kind of the most famous Sufi scholar from the subcontinent. And I was in this big kind of evening Sufi celebration, lots of music, really vibrant. And I turned to my left in the dream, and there was a man with his head back to me with a white hat on. And he turned and looked at me, and his face was decomposed, right? Oh. And it was very Indiana Jones. It was like a snake went out of one eye and in the other, and it said, "Don't come here," right? So I was pretty shaken. I was pretty rattled. But
I mean, for sure, this sounds like the whole thing sounds very Indiana Jones. Like, I know you're doing this like in the 21st century, but it sounds very kind of that 1930s glamour of the photographer off on an adventure with his local picture, and and the premonitory dream. But the assignment that you'd given yourself, the pitch that you'd made, it was inspired by the Dalrymple novel.
That's right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
And so the Dalrymple novel, was that your introduction to the concept of Djinn, or were you already?
No, it was.
The magical sort of supernatural side of
I was always fascinated by the supernatural. I always have been. That's right. It's always been there. But to the concept of Djinn, the introduction was through that book. You know, I mean, a lot of the stories that I shot in India were inspired by Dalrymple's broader work. You know, like he's phenomenal. You know, and he's deeply loved in India as well, because he's
for anyone who's not familiar with him. Dalrymple, can you just what his period? What was his milieu as the writer?
He's a travel writer, travel writer and historian, and he's a Scottish guy. And the City of Djinn's book, was that his first travelogue? I can't remember. I'm not 100% sure if it was his first travelogue, but basically it's an account of his years as a young correspondent in Delhi, like in the late 80s. And he just has a real ability to capture the essence of India. Like it's tragic, it's funny, and it's very informative. Like he manages to kind of just intertwine kind of the rich, broad spectrum of life in India, with its joys and its tragedies, and manages to kind of plot history and context really, really well throughout.
That's incredible. And so this then inspired you to, in your medium of photography, it's like, okay, that type of essence, that type of essence of the Indian experience, I want to go and see if I can capture that. Was that the sort of thing?
Definitely. Like his books were really, really good in terms of like revealing subject matter, that would be of interest. And I would have read his books. There's a collection of essays called 9 Lives, which is kind of like depicting 9 lives in modern India. And that's where I came across the Agori first, so that inspired me to shoot that. But the City of Djinn's one, like I said, I went to the site for Shakulta, photographed the shrines, lots of letters to the Djinn there, and kind of offerings of bread and milk, which anybody who knows about kind of fairy worship in Ireland, the same type of offering. And it was what you'd expect. The Djinn are associated with treasure, and there's lots of letters there, going to help me win the lottery, and but also kind of pleas for help, for various tragedies in people's lives. But I met a Hindu family there. So it wasn't kind of just locked out to kind of these just, Muslims who believed in this side. There was a Hindu family there, and they were doing kind of a week long, it was a 2 week long ritual, like almost like kind of a novena. They were there every day at the same time, and they did kind of a round of prayers and offerings. So they were kind of basically there as supplicants, and we spoke to them, and like through Shams, my fixer, and he was telling us this is what he was doing, and we were like, well, is it working? He's like, yeah, it's worked already. It's starting to work already. So there was that kind of people doing ritual work right there, and so that was interesting. Then we went to there was 2 more sites, but I can't remember the name of the second one. It's like a unpronounceable name, but like it's which it was a very small Sufi shrine in the middle of the kind of the central forest, the central ridge forest in Delhi. We were there on the Thursday, which is kind of when a lot of the activity is there. So people would go there to be exercised and prayed over and all that kind of thing. And it's just this little kind of pillbox shack. Even has a kind of a chintzy welcome mat out the front. But there's 2 particular things that stood out. Was there was an iron chain on the threshold, so hanging from the door. And part of the diagnoses that would happen would be somebody would be brought there saying they're suffering from problems with Djinn. And there was kind of 2 tests that the Sufi peer in the area, who the hereditary caretaker of the site would do. One is like, can they hold the iron chain, iron being repellent to Djinn and to fairies as well, and could they pass the threshold into this holy site? Right, that's where they could know, is there an evil spirit, is there a Djinn? And equally, he would talk about how in vision he would almost see kind of like a green flag saying kind of like it's not Djinn, and then a red flag if it is, right? And what he spoke to kind of recommending mental health services where appropriate, that kind of thing. So and around the kind of the forest, dotted around the forest, with these kind of just random clay pots called matkas, if I remember correctly, and they're just kind of what you would store water in. They're just kind of your bog standard, clay pot. When we asked what's in those, and he was like, Djinn. They're prisons for Djinn, right? So these are like just dotted around the place. I was like, can I go and look at one? He's like, no.
Oh God.
In retrospect, I'm like, thank you. And then the final place we went to was in Nizamuddin, which was is buried in the warren of old Delhi, which is tremendous. It's everything you'd expect. Just like just canopies across these narrow alleys, and just flower wallas, and just like rows and rows of like what is it called again? Like the mutton biryani stalls, and everyone joshing you, trying to get you into their restaurants, and everyone does the best biryani in Delhi. And you then the kind of those kind of restaurants kind of fade away, and you're kind of walking like it's like through your breast, could walk down these avenues, alleys, and then those shops give way to flower stalls, right, and kind of where you could buy offerings essentially, and you're covered, as I said, the alley's all covered by canvases. You take your shoes off, and you're round the corner, and it opens up into this little white marble plaza with the tomb sites there, the tomb of the Sufi saint Nizamuddin. And it was the place from my dream, right?
Oh,
So I'm kind of pretty rattled at this point, but I got a job to do, work with the Sufis there, and take an array of shots, and then eventually, kind of, we worked through where with the Sufi peers that there's a small enclosure where people who have Djinn problems and spirit problems are waiting to be seen, and Shams points me in the right direction. So, that's your shot, right? And when you're taking documentary photography, you tend to think in essay format.
mhm.
Your opening shot, how you build a story, and your closing shot. I know that's the money shot, right? That's
Yeah.
that would kind of really hold the essay together. And I look in the enclosure and go to take the photograph, and it's a man sitting there in a white hat, right? And he's kind of laughing manically at me, but also kind of like, I could tell he wasn't saying good stuff, right? And it was one of those things where I was really rattled. I was just like, I don't know if I want to take this photograph. I don't know what it's going to cost me, and at the same time, I got a fellow photographer behind me going, can you just hurry up and take the shot? Which I did. And that was it. That was kind of the real change in me, where like I was like, this is really weird. This is just strange.
I mean, the way that you tell the story, the whole story, the way that you set the
Yeah.
scene, you really painted us a marvelous picture. And even though like we know what's coming, right? You're gonna see the guy from your dream, but when you said it, honestly, like hair standing on the back of my neck, like it gives you shivers. You're just
Oh, it really did.
I can only imagine what it must have been like to see the place, and then to go for the place you have to go, and then to see the guy. Now, what was the effect then on you? I mean, this is where your life changed. What was the change?
Well, I mean, there was a lot of chaos afterwards, just kind of life stuff. Was kind of into a bit of a tailspin for a couple of months afterwards, which is, again, when you start to get into this world, you understand that's kind of what happened. When you kind of tread on the live wire, as aware, you will get messed with, and that's kind of what happened. It wasn't too bad, I got lots of Sufi blessings when I was there, and it was one of those ones where I got a slap in the face, but I didn't get anything worse,
So what you mean to say is that for a couple of months you were experiencing
nothing supernatural, not just problems.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that you felt were a slap in the face. They weren't just things that were manifesting inside you or your life in reaction. There was an influence.
That's what retrospectively, that's what I think. Yeah.
Because I think that it's true also that, like, I think that also when you have one of those kind of initiatory experiences, that's a bit of a shock or a bit of a revelation. I think also we also go into a bit of an internal tailspin sometimes. Like,
absolutely,
you can feel like you're crazy, or you can start getting into sort of self-destructive behaviors, or you can feel a change in personality. Like, and I think I can see from your reaction that you know exactly what I'm talking about. But you were also feeling that there was like a sort of a, not to say curse, but like a strong jinx on things.
At the time, that's what it felt like. Like there was payback.
Because you had committed a transgression. Like, you were warned not to come, you came anyway.
Yeah.
You got all the obstacles, you kept going, and then you knew that you shouldn't go and take the picture in that place at that time of that man, but you did it.
Yeah.
Why did you do it?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. Like,
something was trying to tell you don't do this, and yet.
Well, there's two aspects to it. So the first part is that I was a photographer. I've I spent a lot of money. I've traveled here, to do this. Yeah, it's my job, or I gotta get it finished. The second part, and how I look at it now, which is the reason why I believe I didn't get that bad at kicking, is this was the first domino, right? It's like I had to go over there, have that experience to start off the chain of events. It wouldn't be a podcast if it wasn't for that.
No,
so that started everything off.
Well, it's interesting because I think it's also a pattern that gets often repeated, is that thing of a transgression or a taboo and a warning and being told to do something, and yet those people who feel compelled to take the step, if they're lucky, it might be the first step on a long journey. And those people, I guess, despite all signs against it, despite all the warnings, they have that vocation, and they're almost being tested more than being forbidden.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's a test of mettle, Just like, do you have the stuff to step into this world? If you're drawn to it, then there's something in you. There's a compulsion in you that is driving you to that area, to that territory. But equally, the spirits will, depending on whose doorbell you ring, right? They will test you to see if you're someone they want to engage with. Have you got the stuff?
Or even, go so far as to destroy you and put you back together. I mean, that's sort of the shaman.
Well, yeah.
Sort of dreams of dismemberment, literally, and being like reconstituted.
100%. Yeah. I mean, it's like it's the first of many initiations, and like as I got kind of deeper into magic and my practice developed and my knowledge base grew, like I take into account how spirits think. Well, that's a very arrogant thing. So I don't know how spirits think, but I take into account what I think they think like, right? Not being human. And part of my daily practice is I petition the spirits that I work with. But I'm careful with my language, in that the Virgin Mary is still part of my pantheon. Although I kind of see her as an amalgamation of the White Lady,
I ditto, right? Being raised as Irish Catholics, the Marian cult is very strong, and it's not necessarily all that Christian.
No, not remotely. Yeah.
But can I ask then, like, so you had this experience, and then you were like, okay, I have a compulsion or vocation. I need to do something. I need to learn. Like you said, you went and sort of expanded your knowledge and your practice. Now, where did you look when you wanted to learn? Like, I mean, you must have felt like, oh God, I have to learn how to handle this stuff. So where does one look? Where did you look?
Initially in the folklore.
Yeah.
So like, I read profusely, with particularly in Djinn lore. There's a book called Legends of the Fire Spirits by Robert Liebling, which is excellent. So anything I get my hands on about Djinn, I consumed. And then I began to notice that there's a remarkable set of parallels with fairy lore, which I just recalled from my childhood. And like the parallels are, I mean, they're so prolific that it's really got me to a position that we're just kind of talking about the same thing, just from a different cultural perspective. There are obviously local differences. Spirits of place are different, but fundamentally it's astonishing, how alike they are. It's like Djinn are associated with treasure. It's like, well, what are leprechauns associated with? Even down to kind of there's a kind of a prophylactic prayer, which was from kind of the Western Mayo, and I can't remember it fully off the top of my head, but it's basically kind of saying there's dirty water coming, get out of the way, to anything that might be there. And you have almost the identical taboo and practice in Cairo.
Is that the one where you're throwing your chamber pot out the window?
Yeah.
There's dirty water coming, like, don't get splashed.
Well, yeah, you're chucking your kitchen water out, chucking your dirty water out, chucking your bed chamber out. It's the same warning, the same practice is in Cairo to Djinn, It's like and it's almost the same phrase, it's remarkable.
When you saw that parallel and you're learning about this, and obviously you've got the Irish kind of upbringing to draw on, and I presume that you probably looked into the folklore and kind of more scholarly stuff on the Irish material as well.
Yeah.
Now, what then in terms of like this is your knowledge, your erudition, but what does one do in this case? What did you look to for practice?
Again, reading. I read a lot of magicians. Magicians' work. Essentially, I was a solitary practitioner. Some online groups, but I just read prolifically. I joined the Thelemic order in London. It didn't really work out. I didn't get what I wanted. No shade on anybody. But realistically, that all those things were kind of dalliances. I played with chaos magic sigils, all that kind of stuff. They were all kind of, varying success.
Everyone should.
Oh yeah.
In terms of chaos magic, at least, I think that if you haven't at least played with it and gotten the insights that it gives you in terms of the interapplicability of different tech, I think it's really useful. I think as a kind of almost like an operating system. Even if you don't end up being a practitioner of that thing, but it's very useful to put things into perspective. Did you find any particular tradition or order or path that ended up holding your interest, or did you just do a kind of a bricolage? Oh, you did.
Very, very, very clearly witchcraft. Like it's, and that is I'm 100% where I am. And that's. It is all I'm really interested in terms of magical practice. As I said, I've explored different avenues, and I got quite a lot of success. What I realize is that I am actually quite sensitive to spirits. I can hear them. I'll have very, very visionary experiences. So if I kind of knock on a door, something will usually answer.
Right.
But witchcraft is 100% where I am, and that's my practice.
Can you I think everyone's got their own ideas, but if you were to give us I don't want a definition, but a sort of like your take, what is witchcraft? What's special about it?
So when we first kind of started chatting, like you mentioned vocation, and I would see my witchcraft practice as very much vocation, like it's kind of like I got witched, right? It wasn't kind of like, oh, this is interesting. No, it was like, this is who you are, this is what you're going to do. It took me a very, very long time to find that. And as I said, I kind of, did the kind of the pinball thing of various different practices till I got there. And when I got there, I just stopped everything else. That was it. But I had some very visceral experiences, some extraordinary visions, which fundamentally changed me. When I talk about the Djinn stuff, that experience, again, that rattled me. But at the same time, I can't say, okay, 100%, I am absolutely sure, that I brushed up against something. There's a doubt there.
Yeah.
With the visionary experience that I had, there was no doubt. You can do as many mental acrobatics as you can. You've just seen something, and experienced something which spoke to you, which knew you, and experienced a vision of such dramatic clarity and spectacle that it was just staggering, to the point where as I said, I can visualize things very strongly. It's no surprise, I'm a photographer. Like it's but my mind's eye, I don't struggle trying to visualize anything. That comes very easy. But this was not hypnagogic. It wasn't kind of like patchy or fadey. I mean, it was like this has been like an IMAX, cinema, right? And it was the Witch Father. It was Lucifer, showed me the sigil, and that wasn't information I took gladly. That he's had some bad press, that wasn't stuff that I was okay with at all. It took me about 3 months before I mentioned it to witch friends, who set me on the path to working with people to kind of understand what happened, and I worked with some excellently gifted psychics to help me determine what happened, and that the dominoes fell faster and faster then, and I started to pick up like symbols that I was shown. I realized I'd seen them like 10, 15 years beforehand, images, all this kind of stuff. So you realize this is going back a long time in your life,
I've had similar in the sense that I've had experiences or met people, spirit people, and realized after a while of interacting with them. Sorry about that. Did I disappear as well, or was it just you?
Yeah, you disappeared.
Okay, that's fine. I'll just pick it up. I'll cut that bit out. There's just a little interruption. But what I was saying, I also have had experiences with spirit beings that I have met and interacted with and talked to, got to know, and then realized, oh, this is the same one I met 10 years ago. Oh, this is the same one I met when I was a kid. Like this one has actually been around all my life.
All your life, yeah.
I just realized that she's the same person that I've been talking to, but also who had been surfacing as a character in fiction that I was writing under different aspects. And you're just like, oh, it's you. You're the one. That kind of thing. And it's just, I mean, as you say, it's not necessarily comfortable. But at that point, you feel like you're marked, like you're,
Yeah. That's exactly it. Yeah. And this is where, as I said, it's, we use the word vocation. But like you, I've been having these kind of experiences all my life, not to the level of intensity. Certainly the interest has been there, but from a very young age. And I think with a reasonable amount of confidence that you can ask any witch, magician, shaman, whatever, whatever they define themselves. When did this start? And you will get that, well, when I was a kid, like it seems to be the pattern, right?
Yeah, it is. And it's, I think that there's an element of, as you say, like the dominoes are falling, and that first experience where there's still an element of doubt, there's still an element of hesitation. But in a sense, we are striving to return to that kind of childlike ability to exist between two worlds and just to accept that it's real. Like as a kid, I think that you don't worry so much about whether you believe or you don't believe. You just know that there are things, and they exist at different sort of frequencies or whatever, or different levels.
Yeah.
But they're all things that are there somehow,
Yeah.
So,
and as an adult, that's part of the testamental, because your worldview is going to be turned upside down. You know, like you will be de-anchored from kind of like everything that you think is robust, and this is how the world is.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah. It's really very destabilizing, because there is a sense in which, as you say, you're de-anchored, you're unmoored from consensus reality, because you're like,
yes,
well, that's not even a thing.
yeah,
You're also, I think that you're also kind of unmoored from caring about the things you're supposed to care about, like in terms of money, career, success, the way they're defined in our society. Even in some ways, propriety in general, like how one is supposed to act and appear. And you're just a bit like, none of that actually interests me anymore, you know? So
yeah,
I think you have to restrain yourself from just kind of like going totally feral and running around the streets with, you know, long hair and a cape,
yeah.
hissing at people.
Yeah, it does tend to go that way. Yeah, like, and it's interesting, you know, this stuff still has power with people, even though, you know, we live in the West in a very secular society that is disenchanted.
Yeah.
When you start talking about kind of like, I see spirits, you know, or, you know, I work with quote unquote the devil, you know, of, you know, a pre-Christian god, that you watch how people react. You know, they're not like, oh yeah, cool, great, yeah, yeah. You know, like it's stuff still has potency. It still has power over people. It still elicits deep-rooted fears and strong reactions. You know,
Yeah. I mean, absolutely, I agree. But I would say that one of the surprising things is how often the reaction is actually fascination, rather than like people recoiling in horror. You know, depending on what you say, of course. I mean, imagine when you say devil, like that's pretty negative, like. But when you say things about magic, enchantment, fairies, spirits, ghosts, whatever, a lot of people I find they go, "Oh yeah, tell me more." That's interesting. And sometimes then they'll go, well, because when I was a kid, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
there's,
yeah.
I'm quite surprised by how, since I've decided to be a bit more open, obviously not shouting from the rooftops, but a bit more open about these things, when I mention them to people, often there is a real interest. People are curious. They're like, oh, wow, really? That must be fascinating. Tell me more about that. You know, maybe I think also a function of the fact that we're in Europe. There's a sort of a different vibe with the type of religiosity that is public in other countries.
Yes.
For sure. I mean, but again, also sometimes when, you know, I lived in Paris for many years, and where you've got a lot of people who would have roots in sort of non-Western or non-European backgrounds and countries. And I remember, like, I was just talking about this to someone recently, how once I started to slightly more embrace my identity as a witch, I started to dress a little bit differently, started to just carry myself a little bit differently. Nothing flagrant, no pointy hats, but, you know, just, you know, a little touch of the dark academia kind of look, you know?
Yeah.
And sometimes strangers, and usually not white people who are like sort of Franco-French, but usually French people who would have a background like in West Africa or North Africa.
Yeah.
But they might be just like, you know, serving me in a shop, or it might be like I'm standing next to them in a queue, or sitting next to them at a cafe. And people would sometimes kind of look at me and be like, excuse me, monsieur, are you a sorcerer? And I would say, well, now that you mention it, and they'd be like, okay, cool, yeah, we have them in my country, you know. But just, you know, but like without any sort of suspicion. They're just kind of interested. They were like, oh, you look like one of them.
Yeah,
So,
that doesn't surprise me. Yeah, I can see that. You know, I can see why people would think that. You know, particularly from the type of cultures you're describing.
Yeah. I mean, you know, our neighbor upstairs was Senegalese, and she was kind of quite a bit of a tribal chief back home, apparently, like village head woman. But she used to, we never knew why there was all these people constantly calling up to her house and turning up and ringing our doorbell looking for her. And it turns out she was hosting shamans
Oh,
who were
wow.
consulting with people. You know,
Yeah.
she was having like sort of consultations in her apartment.
Right.
You know, so it was just going on, you know.
Cool.
Yeah. But getting back to your story though, I wanted to ask you about you've come to this point now in the story where you're starting to learn all these techniques, you're getting to grips with the kind of the new reality, the fallen dominoes. And then you've got your work, which is your photography. So on the one hand, I would be interested to know, how did it change your work, if it did, your art as an expression of this new kind of worldview, and your other art, which is as a host and sort of disseminator of stories about spirits. You were called to produce that art. So
yes.
What happened?
So if I take a quick, just one step back, because there's an important piece that I need to reference, which is I'm a really keen gardener. You know, so I spend an awful lot of time in my back garden, growing stuff, right? And just that's a quite important piece of it, because that changed how I saw the world and how I reacted with things. I become a lot more observant of nature and what's happening around me, closer to the seasons, right? Also building up an energetic connection with the land I lived in. So I built up a very strong relationship.
Was that something that, like, had you had a garden before and just not been that into it? Had you already been into gardening and this just deepened it?
On and off, but I hadn't had the opportunity. This is kind of in the house I live in now. We had a garden, so I was able to do that. But it's something I've always been drawn to, and that's where a lot of stuff happened. You know, where I spent some time at night as well in the garden, outside smoking or whatever, and I'd start to hear things call my name, touch, you know, my hair being touched, that kind of stuff. When I had hair, like, so you start to kind of build up that connection with the spirits of place, you know, and like all that time that I'm working on the garden, like organically growing stuff, tending to it, improving the soil, you know, eating what I produce and composting and all that kind of stuff, you're building up you know, you're kind of putting money in the bank with the spirits of place, you know, because you're stewarding the place, you're facilitating nature.
A real spiritual practice as well, because
it absolutely is.
You're entering into the ecosystem, and you're entering into it, and not just as a master, but as a participant.
Absolutely.
To me, it sounds like you sort of hit that lovely sweet spot of like getting into right relation.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it, right? And that's a fundamental part of it, right? You know, it absolutely is, because like, for me, witchcraft is inherently tied to nature. Like, it just is, you know, for me, you know. I don't like to say absolutes, it's not really fair, other people have different views and things, but for me it is, you know. And that's been part of my practice for a long time. So in my daily work, I petition the spirits of place. I offer to them, you know, and in some of the work that I do with my patrons, as a talk about how I do that, you know, this is part of my practice, you know, how you build that energetic connection with place, like meditating on the land, like particularly at night, you know. And if you think about it in a way, really, if you look at kind of, say, like your famous witchcraft accounts, like the Scottish witch trials, all that kind of stuff, you're getting as close as you can to emulating the life of, you know, a 15th century like Gaelic peasant, you know, like that's
growing your own food,
you know,
for example, working the land,
exactly, you know. But that's where stuff happened. But going back to the podcast, so the photography kind of petered out for me. In a way, it just wasn't financially viable long term. So that kind of was taking a back seat. But really, my creative energy moved into the podcast. And what kept happening is I kept getting exposed to this figure, the Dark Man, through folklore, through the accounts of various guests. It kept coming up again and again.
Yeah.
And I just noticed the pattern. I was like, this seems to come up in folklore quite a bit as well. Until it turned up in my life as well, right? In that vision I mentioned. But the really interesting thing is that this figure manifests so many different ways, right? So many different names, so many ways that it appears. But one of the ways it appears is like as a dark figure. You can see kind of the cosmos in. You can see stars in its body, right?
Oh, wow.
And it has the kind of the flame of illumination, famously, right? The flame between the horns is the flame of illumination, and sometimes called the headless one. So the headless right, is tied to this spirit. I took a photograph on a beach near me. I went out to shoot the meteor showers. And the best image I took was, I was finding range, which is basically kind of standing back from the camera and seeing if I'm sharp. And I know that everything behind me will be sharp. But the only way to do that at night was with a head torch. So I had to kind of switch to red, it's easier on the eyes, and was seeing if I could get that light sharp. And basically what happened was I took the photograph that is the icon for spirit box, which is that figure standing there with the red flame, right? That looks headless. It only dawned on me like 3 years afterwards. I was like literally the iconography for the show is the Dark Man, and
it already was. It already was. That's amazing. Like,
yeah,
I think that's again something that one comes across is this idea that the kind of the causality of symbols works both backwards and forwards.
Yeah.
Like an event that hasn't happened yet for you can manifest now, and you won't understand until you the event caused the ripple that came back.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. I love that. I love that when when your own life has like good motifs and symbolic consistency. But did you so the photography you kind of gradually wrapped it up, and so I presume you've taken on some other kind of job, some kind of day job.
But I've always kind of been like a contractor and a photographer. I'd kind of do 50-50. So now I'm just kind of primarily contractor.
What contractor you mean building?
No, I just mean like professional contractor for agencies, that kind of thing. Like to deliver work for agencies.
Photography work though?
No, it could be like digital work, marketing, all that kind of stuff.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry. I was confused because I don't know the word contractor that way, but yeah, I see.
Yeah.
So you went back to mostly doing that, but then you had the podcast that you started off, and it was kind of telling your stories that you had about Djinn. Yeah. And then when people heard the material, they were like, this needs to be a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And you felt that. So you started doing the podcast, and you started then also in the podcast, these things started showing up, like drawing it together into a kind of a net.
Yeah. So I was being funneled down in a particular direction. So to notice this pattern, the principal thing, kind of noticing the same pattern existing in folklore and existing in witchcraft. I would have never gotten there without the podcast. And the podcast really provided me with the creative outlet that I need to have. So it wasn't that I kind of, massively mourned not doing photography anymore. I really didn't, because, this gave me something that really kind of sated my curiosity. I mean, fundamentally, that's where photography comes from. That's where the podcast comes from. It's that curiosity, that kind of need to explore, that need to understand.
That it's not so much about, I mean, obviously there was like an aesthetic element and a documentary element. It was about the exploration, like the curiosity, the search, and which is something I love about your podcast, is that sort of that curiosity and that sense that you are endlessly interested. You know, in people's stories and what they have to say, and endlessly open to learning new stuff, avid to learn new stuff. I love that. So did you feel, though, apart from what it was doing for you, do you feel that the vocation to do the podcast, how do you feel about the way that it serves your audience? And how do you feel about, is it also serving your patrons? Are they motivating it? Are they behind it? Are they pleased with it, kind of thing?
I get the feedback that I get is generally pretty good, you know. And I do get a lot of people kind of writing to me, kind of going, "Thank you for this, because you've helped me kind of, you know, your podcast and the interviews helped me kind of process stuff that I didn't have a language for." You know, I mean, when I initially kind of set it out, the idea was looking at kind of spirits from different perspectives, right? Like, you know, from like religious perspectives, traditional religion perspectives. That's what we're trying to look at. You know, how do we look at all sides of this? Over the last year and a half, it's become a lot more focused on magic, but there are kind of other kind of areas that I just find interesting. I want to kind of, you know, let's do something about Atlantis, you know. But an
Atlantis episode, I haven't heard that one.
Oh, it's coming up. It'll be
nice.
Yeah, out this month at some stage. But I think that's the principal thing. It's people who have been the kind of same as me. They're on the threshold of something. They're not really sure what's going on. And this actually gives some signposting. This might be what's happening, you know.
It also, I think that this is something that is very important, which is, it's what it gave to me, like as a guest. It's what it gives me as a listener, and I bet you it's what it gives other people. Is that it's the importance of sharing our stories with each other. You know, telling each other, me too. I experienced something along those lines, or this, because it tells people that, you know, as you say, that helps them to process. It helps them to know that they're not alone in this, that they're not crazy. And also, I think, helps us all to reinforce our sort of, or no, let me put it the other way. It helps us to continue dismantling our unbelief.
I like that. I like that, you know, and the other kind of, you know, pulling that thread a little bit is, this is also kind of part of my role is to add a little bit more enchantment through this show. You know, every single guest who's on it, everyone who your own podcast, your own work, everybody else is doing this stuff. They're all adding that little bit more of enchantment, you know, that is re-sacralizing our world, you know.
Absolutely.
Like,
I think that you know, if there is a sort of a common vocation that I feel very much with the people who I really sort of resonate with, who are doing these things, it is that, like, it's not about sort of, you know, who gets the highest grade in the order. It's not about who has the most aesthetic, witchy altar, and it's not who has the most followers. It's that we feel a sense of mission to re-enchant the world.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is, you know. And like, in a lot of ways, I feel like I was commissioned by the Dark Man, you know. Like,
that's actually, I'm imagining a really awesome sort of like, you know, comic book or TV series or something, like, you know, He was a freelance photographer. He was about to receive a commission he couldn't refuse. You know, like, you've never had a job as big as this. But yeah, like, it's a commission. It's a mission.
Yeah, it is. You know, I mean, like, it's when I think about kind of like, say, the amount of people who've actually heard my podcast, you know, like,
do you have any idea what the figures are? Like,
I could fill Crow Park twice, right, with the amount of plays that the show has had. You know, like, it's
wow.
Yeah, you know. So if you consider it in that context, that each episode is, and this is how I see it, each episode is a little spark of enchantment that goes out. You know, and like, you know, I'm always slagging off social media. You know, I'm just, you know, I'm a middle-aged man. What else am I supposed to be doing? You know, but it's like, but I'm constantly putting out content at the same time. You know, that's highly dependent on the digital world. You know, so, but equally, like, when you talk about what you care about, it's like, I don't really worry about social media figures. You know, what's my social media reach? It doesn't really matter to me. You know,
I wasn't interested in, like, sort of the statistics. I was more interested in exactly what you gave, which is that image of, like, thousands of people. You know, like, it's interesting because it's a very different way, I guess, of conceiving of the idea of reach. Like, you're not talking about, you know, my post reach has dropped 20% since last month, since the previous 30 days. It's more like, how many hearts have I touched, you know, with my story, with my spark. Like, that's awesome. I love it.
Yeah.
Now you know, I think I agree with you that social media is stupid and silly and ugly, but it all depends on who's doing it too, because like, there are other people out there, either on Instagram or or Facebook, or even TikTok. I'm way too old for TikTok, but I do dabble occasionally. And sometimes you come across stuff and you're like, whoa, that's amazing. Like, that made me laugh, that made me cry, that touched me, that informed me. And you just go, in the old days, none of these people would have been able to publish a book, right? Their voice would not be heard, you know, unless they were, like, on a street corner shouting. You know, they wouldn't get very far. And this tool, every idiot can use it, but also every idiot can use it. Like, we can speak to more people.
No, like, I mean, like, and, you know, when I have a pop at it, like, that's just my kind of my inner grump, really, because, like, there's people out there doing amazing stuff on it, and they're doing exactly, you know, probably in far better ways, and reaching far more people, doing exactly that, putting out sparks, you know, of inspiration, of beauty, you know. Like, I think more broadly, there's challenges in how certain types of behaviors are encouraged, that I don't think are healthy, but, you know, that's not really news. But
and that's, I mean, that's the case sort of across society in general. You know, and also, I mean, let's not go down the road of dissecting social media. We could. I'm sure it'd be
no, it's all right. I mean, to be honest with you, anybody listens to my show or must be like, oh my god, he's off again about it. Jeez.
it's like, oh my god, Darragh's shouting, get off my lawn at TikTokers.
I mean, to be fair, like, I mean, you know, I probably, you know, I don't really contribute a huge amount to it, but, like, you know, I still enjoy, you know, watching skateboarders fall off shit, you know, that kind of stuff.
Of course. You know, mild human suffering is funny.
just a touch. Just a touch.
Especially if it's their own fault. Anyway, what I was going to say though was, I was setting up an excellent segue, but we've lost it now, which was, not everybody gets to publish a book, but I have heard, and this was a couple of weeks ago, I was listening to you interviewing, who was it? Sasha Ravich, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
And that was an amazing interview because she's a really incredibly interesting person.
Yes.
But you happened to mention, my ears pricked up, something about your progress on your manuscript for your book. And I wanted to ask if you would like to say a little bit about it.
So it's called Song of the Dark Man, Father of Witches. That's the working title. And it's probably the kind of the final bit of the commission, you know.
I mean, when you said the title, I was like, oh wow, that's the sort of the crowning element of this whole edifice, isn't it?
It really is. So basically, I look at the pattern of the Witch Father, the Far Dove Durka, as he appears in Irish folklore, and I kind of set up talking about this kind of like trickster figure, and pull the thread, looking at primarily Irish folklore, some British as well, rather, and kind of build out the pattern, because you can give these kind of epithets, but they're you know, the identity, the form, you know, is ever shifting, and
you know, I think it's worth sort of mentioning, like, because I remember that we chatted a little bit about this, like, well, 2 years ago with some of the Coffee and Cards crew, and we were talking about this, and just, you know, that idea that this is the Fardurcha in Irish, the Dark Man, who is, as you say, analogous but not exactly mapped onto that the Black Man or the Witch Father that appears in particularly like the Scottish witch trial material and stuff. But also that this is not the same thing as Satan. It's not the same thing as Lucifer. It's would you say it's what we might call the folkloric devil? Is that the?
I would say yes. Yeah. But I mean, for me, they're kind of intertwined with Lucifer. For others, with Samuel. But there's some very interesting stuff that happens in the Irish folklore which correlates with the Scottish witch trial. So, you know, famously, we've got Isabel Gowdy's Confessions. But the Dark Man, the Black Man, turns up again and again and again in the Scottish witch trial accounts, just repeatedly. But what is particularly interesting is the descriptions of him, because again, we've got the shifting stuff, but it's always like, you know, he's got you know, he's a deer's body from the waist down, or, you know, cloven hooves, where you see the same motifs come up again and again, which are extraordinarily similar to certain key folkloric stories from Ireland. So if we look at the story of Oisin, and Oisin's birth, or Oisin's conception, so the Dark Man turns up in the Fianna cycle as the Black Call, and depending on which version of the stories you read, it's like the Dark Druid or the Black Magician of the canon. But the story goes that Fion's out hunting deer with the Fianna. They find a doe. His dogs won't attack the doe, and she seems completely tame. And then he just brings her back to his castle. That night, the most beautiful woman walks into his room, called Sive, introduces herself, as a fairy woman and asks his protection from the far dove, the black magician of the Menagod. So first thing, we have fairy woman as a deer. So this motif turns up again and again and again, like in the metrical Djinn-Shaxis. I can never pronounce that. But there's a poem talking about fairy woman being turned into a deer. Don Dove brings the Fianna to his otherworld kingdom by having them chase a deer who turns out to be a fairy woman in the form of a deer. So you get repeatedly the same thing, right? And then Don Dove is interesting because this is a god of death, so very similar type of territory as the Dark Man. So it's woman as a deer, woman as a deer, woman as a deer. Now, when Saiva it leaves Fionn or is taken away from Fionn, the Dark Man appears as Fionn coming back from a battle. Saiva runs out to greet him. Once she's outside the walls and gets closer, he transforms, shapeshifts back into the Dark Man, touches her on the head with a hazel wand. She turns into a deer and she's never seen again. Right. And then some years later, Fionn has searched Ireland trying to find Saiva, but can't. But they find this young boy, little blonde boy, who he recognizes as looking like Saiva, and realizes it's his son, which is Oisín.
Which means little deer.
Yeah. And then through the various different kind of adventures of the Fianna, as you know, Oisín meets another fairy woman while they're out deer hunting, Niamh Kinor, and off they go to Tir na Nog, and then when he returns with the instruction not to touch the ground, and he does, it's various different stories, as I'm sure you're familiar with. But anyway, through ill fate, he touches the ground and ages immediately, and is in a different Ireland. Is in the Ireland of kind of early Christian Ireland. Wonderfully in kind of the account I have, like Oisín describes this Ireland as like bell ringers and clerks, which really would crack me up, because essentially this was transcribed by the initial versions were transcribed by monks, right? So
self-satire, isn't it?
Well, there is, but I also think it belies something that you and I spoke about when we first spoke, which is that kind of dual practice, and I think that those kind of early Christian monks could probably hold both worlds reasonably, without a huge amount of conflict, because there's debates. There's a chapter called The Arguments, which is back and forth between St. Patrick and Oisín. So when you think about that, you've got somebody who is half fairy arguing the case for the Fianna and why they shouldn't go to hell because they're not Christians, with St. Patrick, and doing quite well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That is fascinating. I guess that they were open to the idea that there's an argument to be made, and they knew the argument. They knew the argument to be made, and I think anyone who sort of you hear the kind of the people who don't know their Irish history very well talking about the Christianization as a kind of a violent and sudden and kind of conquesty. So I've even heard people talk about it as like pagan genocide. Total nonsense, because it happened slowly and absolutely consensually, and also absolutely not completely. Like, if you look at the Brehon texts, like there's records still during the Christian era, because the writing was only there after the Christian era, of the hostage price of a druid. And of the druid. Like, it's quite funny because they talk at the very beginning in the Brehon texts, the druids have a high social status, and like 200 years later they're still there, but they're considered like kind of only just around the level of kind of generic craftsmen. They're no longer like in the noble stratum. They're probably like sort of hedge wizards at that point, knocking around, but they're still knocking around. They're still druids. And I think that when you read as you are, giving us an account of, when you read these texts, the mythological cycles that were written down by Christian monks, there is absolutely clearly a fascination, an interest, and a respect for the material.
Yeah.
Even though it's deformed by time and by ideology, because
Yeah.
they kind of try to write it into a Christian, they try to mesh it with sort of biblical history and stuff, but they're clearly writing with huge and just enjoyment sometimes. Like you read some of that stuff, and it's funny. The Fiannicht, the Fionn cycle, there's a lot of very funny stuff in it. Playful.
Yeah, it's wonderful stuff. But so I kind of paint that picture of well, the Dark Man. We talk about Dominoes. He's the one that kind of bridges this gap between kind of mythical Ireland and early Christian Ireland. He sets that off.
Interesting.
And shapeshifter. He's a trickster. So I talk then about kind of like how you get these trickster figures that actually change culture. Their influence. Whatever machinations that that are beyond the scope of our understanding, they affect culture. It shifts, it changes. And I talk about that in history.
That idea of them as not just culture heroes or culture bearers, but like catalysts.
Yes.
Culture shifters.
Yep.
And I can totally see it, because even with the archetype of like the sort of the firebringer archetype is a trickster in many ways. Like sort of Prometheus has a kind of a trickster element to him, because he's bold and he does what he's not supposed to. But they're the ones who bring fire to humanity.
Exactly.
That's really cool. I love that. And I think that what you're talking about, that figure of the Dark Man, he is in the shadows throughout the folklore, the mythology, but he's there. Like there's a thread.
Yeah.
And he keeps coming back, as you say, under different guidance, often presented as a druid or sorcerer or something. But he keeps coming back. This is fascinating. Now, do you, having established all of this kind of the background, the literature, where do you go with it? Is it kind of is it a survey of the folklore, or are you kind of?
It's initially the first half of the book is folklore and witchcraft. The first half of the book is folklore and witchcraft. Now, as I say, I talk about kind of the trickster's cultural influence, and how it's there, and I talk a bit about kind of Springheel Jack, how he brought the kind of the fear of nature, the fear of the wilderness, the fear of the devil back to Victorian England when this was the greatest power on earth. Like Springheel Jack kept turning up at Aldershot barracks, right? Like literally, the epicenter of military might of the British Empire. And this figure would run up and, bounce out of the darkness, slap a sentry in the face, and disappear again with this, and the various descriptions of him, the dark figure, these flaming eyes, ice cold touch, we talk about some identifiers. The ice cold touch comes up again and again. Isabel Gowdy's accounts, they talk about sex with the Dark Man and describe him as being, as cold as spring water up inside them. And it's extraordinary. There's just little tidbits of details. You're like, that's the same as that. That's the same as a bit in that story. Now, one of the really interesting things about Isabel Gowdy in one of her accounts, when she describes meeting the Dark Man, is that she meets him while she's walking along a road at night, right? And he propositions her. This is a thing that comes up again and again, is this interception. The Dark Man appears generally in story. He appears on the road. He appears while one is moving from one place to another. He is the dark interceptor. And it's again, you're talking about, it's a liminal place. It's always in these places of liminality, and with Isabel Gowdy, when she does go ahead and commit to the Dark Man, she describes how Sometimes he would turn up as a man dressed in black. Sometimes he would have the legs of a ray, which is an old term for a roe deer. So he would turn up as this half man, half animal, this therianthropic figure, which I call a kind of a composite being.
Yeah.
And this is throughout. This theme is absolutely there. And it's the mirror of the Fenian cycle and the folklore, the fairy women who were deer and then turned into human beings. And that kind of the opposite happens, where kind of like the opposite is a reflection of it. It's the same thing turning up again, in the opposite form continually throughout the accounts of Gaudi, and several dozen accounts of Scottish witches. So that's kind of what I talk about. I talk about kind of like the pattern, how it evolves through the folklore, and it's not just the transmutation, the therianthropic figures. There's so many aspects to the pattern that are narrative drivers in mythology and folklore that come up again in the accounts of these 15th, 16th century witches. Now, where the book kind of gets a little bit more interesting, that's a terrible thing to say about my own book, where it gets, I think, a bit more punchy is the second half of the book is basically witnesses. So it's interviews with contemporaries who have experienced him.
Oh, wow. Because you're talking about interviews that you have gathered with your contemporaries, contacts, people who've been referred to you, people you found. Are they mostly anonymous, or how did you proceed with that?
No, they're not anonymous. They're a lot of them have been on my show,
Okay. So they're people who, for example, what I mean by that is like one might, if one is, let's say, familiar with your show and the kind of the milieu, see the accounts of people that will recognize, will go, oh, I know that person's book, or I've heard of that person, and here's okay, cool. And did you, after kind of doing your interview gathering, well, I want to ask, well, what conclusions did you come to? But maybe that we should leave that for the book, like people can read it. Do you have a publisher for it?
Yes. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, Inner Traditions. It's with them now. It's with them for a couple of months. So like I should be assigned my project editor, and then we do
excellent. And so that
Lena Haystack bits.
And then so what we could maybe hope for coming out next year, maybe something like that.
I think it'll be either sometime in winter.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah,
which is fitting.
Yes.
That's really exciting, and it sounds like an excellent project. And I think that I don't think I've ever seen that format whereby somebody traces a figure through the folklore, through the mythology, and up to the present day with eyewitness accounts. I don't think I've seen that before. Are you aware of anyone else who's taken that approach?
I honestly, I'm not. I think that's what makes it punchy. Because we the first half of the book is building out the kind of the folkloric theme, but the second half is magicians and witches talking about kind of their experiences, with different aspects of what I call the kind of the pattern of the dark man.
The only thing that I could compare it to would be something like where they go the opposite way around, where somebody will, for example, take a bunch of eyewitness accounts of cryptids or UFOs, and then they'll go backwards and see if they can find antecedents in the lore. Which is a bit like the kind of the Jacques Vallée approach, where he's like, well, actually, UFOs have been around forever. They just used to be called fairies. Whereas you're going the other way around, like you're saying, okay, I'm going to identify and sort of give the evidence for the figure and draw the figure and who he is from the historical record.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to show you that it persists.
Yeah. And this goes back to deep antiquity, like I draw on, I'm sure you know this, but there's a famous bit of cave art in the Trois Frères cave in France of
quite near where I live.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah,
I'm in that region.
Yeah. Of called the Sorcerer,
yes.
which a lot of it has been made of it. But I talk about kind of, because one of the areas that a lot of witches go to is in vision, is they go to a cave with a pool in it, and I call it the dark womb. Lots of other people seem to go there. It's a theme that comes up quite a bit.
I've been there. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Yeah. And this is, it is a place where you will get ripped apart and put back together again. But I kind of talk about how this is where I start to talk about the therianthropic nature of the composite being. What is the figure? What is the spirit telling us when it presents as half human, half beast? That sorcerer image.
For anyone who doesn't know it's a very famous image, but they might not know it by name. Can you just describe the sorcerer of the
It is an antlered, it's like an upright, looks like a human being, 2 arms, 2 legs, but on inspection there's antlers. The face is that of a deer, the face is that of an owl, and the lower half of the body, the legs are kind of going the not a human way, with hooves, and he's a tail, and kind of hunched over. It's like the torso looks a little bit like an animal's like body, but it's quite clearly part human. And there's a few of these in like similar representations in French cave art. But what I kind of, the thread I pulled on that is like, well, these therianthropic figures are experienced when you go to the dark womb, and sometimes the dark man presents like that, this constant shifting pattern, And the question I asked about that was, well, why is that? What's been said to us, right? And then you look at the dark man, the mythos around him, the illuminator. He is the dark one that brings the flame of illumination, and there seems to be this constant contradiction, And it's like the dark womb, that's a womb of making and unmaking, right? The therianthropic figure, part animal, part human. And I kind of get to the position that this is a continual non-dualistic metaphor. It's telling you constantly that there is no separation from nature. There's no separation from each other, and that the idea of the division of these polarities of like good and evil, they don't exist. Like darkness contains the promise of light.
Or indeed a sort of a body and soul dualism, or mind body, or I think that's fantastic. I really that idea, that thesis, really speaks to me. I think it's going to be an excellent book. So
thank you.
I'm looking forward to it. I guess that I'm probably going to wrap it up now, because we've gone a bit over the usual time that I would expect, but I think that was entirely justified, and actually we could probably keep going, but we will perhaps call it a night for tonight and say until another time. Where can people look you up, find you, see your work at the moment?
So I'm on Instagram as Darragh Mason. That's my only aperture into the social media world, for the reasons we've already discussed. And And just Google Darragh Mason, at Spirit Box, they find me.
Absolutely. And I'll put that I'll put those links in the show notes, of course. And as I said, highly recommend Spirit Box. If you want someone who is a gentleman and a scholar, you have to have an Irishman, really. Camille, that was absolutely brilliant. I'm really excited about this book. And in the meantime,
thank you.
I'll just keep listening to Spirit Box.
Awesome. Well, been a pleasure catching up with you.
Absolutely, you too. And I'll talk to you again soon. Thank you very much, Darragh. Good night.
My pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.